Good morning and welcome. Welcome to this third week of Summer Forum. You're in for several treats this morning. Over the weekend, I was giving a lot of thought to how folks were celebrating the 4th of July. And I have about 600 people on my Facebook friends list, and some of them are as young as my great-great-grand nieces and nephews, and some that are a generation older than me. And the thing I noticed was the nostalgia about the 4th. People were remembering the good times from years gone by. A few would send patriotic messages about the 4th of July. But some of you know that my training is in history, and particularly the history of ideas. And one of the things that I'm acutely aware of is in any given period of time, who were the cutting-edge leaders. So as I was reflecting on the Declaration of Independence, I was made aware that the signers realized it was a death sentence to put their name on this document because every word of it was treason against the British government, the English government. And for me, that was a sobering thought. Here were people who in our day we look at with a nostalgia, and that's not how they looked at it. They thought they might not wake up the next day. Well, this morning, on the back page of the Salt Lake Tribune was a full-page ad paid for by the Hobby Lobby Corporation. And it's full of quotations from who they call the Founding Fathers. And all the quotes were about God, Christianity, the Bible, Jesus. And the conclusion I drew is, folks, nothing new here. Pass right on by. These Founding Fathers had no differences with the Church of England or with the King of England. They all believed in the same religion. And that's not how I took that you don't get your life in jeopardy by just going along with what everybody else believes. So I take that in a way as a theme for our program this morning. We're going to hear some music from the time of Shakespeare. And we're going to hear some reflections about the creativity of Shakespeare. And what I would like to invite you to do is to hear what would have been considered new or fresh or troubling or radical or unsettling about the music or about the talk. So I'm going to invite our Madrigal group to come and perform some music from Shakespeare's contemporaries, and I hope you'll be surprised at what you hear when you hear it in the context. Singers?
So we're going to sing a duet by Thomas Morley, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare. He actually lived in the same parish that Shakespeare lived in. From 1557 to 1603, so right at the same time. They probably went to church together and got water from the same watering hole. And he's actually one of two of Shakespeare's contemporaries whose musical settings of Shakespeare poems have actually survived to this day. So this duet is called Sweet Nymph, Come to Thy Lover. It's from a collection of canzonettas that Morley wrote. And the poem goes, Sweet nymph, come to thy lover. Lo, here alone our loves we may discover, where the sweet nightingale with wanton glosses, hark, her love too discloses. Sweet nymph, come to
Sweet nymph,
the
come
lover,
to
to
thy
thy
lover.
lover. Sweet nymph, come to
Sweet nymph, come to
thy
thy
lover.
Lo, here alone our loves we may discover.
Sweet nymph, come to
Sweet nymph,
thy
come
lover,
to
to
thy
thy lover.
lover.
Sweet nymph, come to
Sweet nymph, come to
thy lover.
Lo, here alone our loves we may discover.
Where the sweet nightingale
with
wanton glosses, hark her love discloses. Hark her love discloses. Where the sweet nightingale with wanton glosses, hark her love discloses. Hark her love discloses.
Several weeks ago, one of our members here, a good friend, Carol Romagosa, approached me and said, I'm taking a class from Dr. Mark Matheson on Shakespeare, and it's a great class, and I'm learning a lot. But what's really interesting to me is little throwaway lines he gives about how things were in Shakespeare's time. And I'm particularly intrigued, she said, by how Shakespeare wrote the women characters in his plays, and how Professor Matheson would make comments about how those women were perceived in that time in comparison to what the conventional writers about women and the society taught about women. And I asked Carol, do you suppose he has enough of those throwaway lines to make a presentation? And she said, I don't know, but I'll ask him. And it turned out the answer was yes. And so here we are with Professor Mark Matheson. Was the bard a feminist is my term for it. Welcome, Dr. Matheson.
Well, I want to thank Reverend Strong, and I want to thank Carol too. It's just a great honor for me to be with all of you this morning, and I wanted to start out just talking a little bit about history and about place before I get to Shakespeare. And this church has always been part of my experience since childhood. And this neighborhood was the neighborhood of my father and of his father and mother and their family. In the 1930s, in the midst of the Depression, my father, as a young child, lived with his family in the second bungalow up the street here toward Friendship Manor, and he is still very much with us and robust today, and he loves to tour the neighborhood and talk about the old times in the home that he lived in there. My father is Dr. Stephen Matheson. He's a retired dentist, and his father was Scott Matheson Sr., whom I never got to know. He died the year before I was born. He died in 1958, and I was born in 1959. The family had moved at that time over to a home just off the southwest corner of the old East High football field on 9th South and 12th East. And my grandfather was a remarkable man. He came over from, his father rather, came over from Scotland as an immigrant in the 19th century. He was legally blind, my great-grandfather, and he pushed the broom at Parowan High School down in southern Utah, where the family is from. He did janitorial work there and had a very large family, and only one of his children graduated from high school, and that was my grandfather Scott. And he went on, as some remarkable people did from the Utah community in those days, to get a professional degree. It was in law at the University of Chicago. And he came back here and was U.S. attorney for Utah in the late 1940s and 1950s, appointed by Harry Truman. You probably know that my stock is all of the Democratic Party, which is one reason why I'm so happy to be here. But one of the things that stands out for me about my grandfather, Scott, was that he was part of this church community. And he had, of course, come from a Mormon background in southern Utah, but he also was an explorer, and he journeyed spiritually and intellectually. And he was part of the Unitarian community here. And one resonant fact comes down to me from that time, and that is that he played one of the three wise men in a Christmas pageant back in the 1930s that was put on by this congregation. So those roots go very deep, and all my life I've gone up and down 13th East and enjoyed, as I told Reverend Strawn, the wonderful New England architecture and the spire of this church. I specialize in Shakespeare and Renaissance literature, but I'm profoundly attracted to American literature in the 19th century, and particularly the literature of the New England transcendentalists. And the deep Unitarian roots of that tradition are very important, and it's a literature that I think we still are trying to catch up with as Americans and as world citizens. And I think I'll, in a sense, be saying the same thing about Shakespeare and his representation of women, that we may live 400 years beyond him, but in terms of his vision of what is possible for human beings, men and women both, I think we are still catching up. And there's great reason to study his work, not simply as a kind of historical document, but rather as a vision. I think he's very much underestimated as a visionary writer. We tend to think of Shakespeare as the great realist, the person who is showing us life as it is, and he certainly is a great realist writer, but he's also a kind of mythic and visionary writer. And I think that in my courses, in my teaching, which is now in about its 25th year at the university, I really am moving more and more to an understanding of Shakespeare as someone who is projecting an extraordinary vision for us to approach, to share, and to live out in our own lives. And so I'll be saying a little bit about that. I also wanted to mention just briefly that one of the things I do at the university is direct a small office called the Muse Project. It came into existence about 5 years ago. It's entirely dedicated to enriching undergraduate education at the University of Utah. And there was a felt need for this office. I've had a wonderful time working with Hugo over these last 5 years in moving forward our projects to enrich undergraduate education. As you know, the university is a complex institution. It has many different missions, and it's surprisingly, perhaps shockingly, possible for the undergraduate education mission to somehow become neglected, in part because it's not a profitable enterprise. It's not a part of the university's total institutional life that produces revenue, and yet I feel that it's the most important thing we do at the University of Utah, and so I was thrilled to take this position. Essentially what we try to do is to remind undergraduate students, or perhaps to introduce them to the idea for the first time, that the world is far vaster and more beautiful than they know. And what we try to do, as our name Muse suggests, is inspire them with that sense. And we've been having a guest speaker for a number of years come from the national scene. Wes Moore, a remarkable African-American writer, combat veteran, Rhodes Scholar, was here a couple of years ago. This past year in January, we hosted Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the United States Supreme Court, and she clearly is one of the most remarkable human beings I have ever met, and her power to inspire students on our campus, all the rest of us on our campus, and students from local schools was just extraordinary. And I'd like to make an announcement about our speaker this year, which we just firmed up on Thursday before the holiday weekend. And I am thrilled. Our theme this year is community, and we are going to be bringing Congressman John Lewis to the University of Utah. He's one of my heroes. You'll remember that Congressman Lewis was among the first group of freedom riders in 1961 during that ride to the South in support of a Supreme Court decision. He was beaten terribly. You'll remember that he spoke just before Martin Luther King at the Emancipation March on Washington in August 28th, in fact, of 1963. He's the only surviving speaker from that day. What Dr. King called, when he rose to the podium on that occasion, the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of this country. And I walked into your church this morning and I saw the banner that says Black Lives Matter. And I thought about that. John Lewis was also first across the bridge at Selma, Alabama in 1965 in a march for voting rights, once again when he was severely beaten. He has an extraordinary philosophy of life based on nonviolence and on the friendship and the mentoring of the person whom he credits with establishing his life as it has come to be, and that is Dr. King. And he's a great advocate of nonviolent and spiritual work for change. And so I'm absolutely thrilled that he's agreed to come out and to answer the Macedonian call, as I'm going to tell him, of those of us in Utah who really need to hear him. And he will be speaking at the Huntsman Center as Justice Sotomayor did last year, but it will be a little bit earlier. He will speak at 11 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, November 10th. So please, the tickets will be free. Please set that down on your calendars and bring all of your friends. I think it's going to be an extraordinary moment for the American West and our region, as well as for our university and our students and our local community. Well, one thing gets woven into another, as Carol has suggested, and I just wanted to answer your call for a few words about Shakespeare and women in Shakespeare by talking about three plays and focusing on three women characters. Reverend Strawn poses the question, was Shakespeare a feminist? I think people will debate that to the end of time. But I think that the evidence for me clearly suggests that in fact he was, in the deepest sense, just that. And I want to look at three of his women characters and follow their lives in the dramatic action of the respective plays in which they appear, as a means of at least provoking thought about the degree to which Shakespeare is writing in a very enlightened way about women, about the problems they face, the challenges they face in a world that was very much male-dominated, and also about the value that women bear in a society that did not always acknowledge that intrinsic value. The first character I want to talk about is Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. It's a comedy, a romantic comedy, a late romantic comedy from Shakespeare, about 1601. And the three plays I'm going to be talking about are Much Ado, which is a late romantic comedy, Othello, which of course is a high tragedy from the great tragic sequence of plays that Shakespeare went on to write, and then finally The Winter's Tale, a very late play from yet another different genre, the genre of tragicomedy, or as I think it's probably better called, romance. And so we see women in different aesthetic manifestations, different categories of drama in the three plays that I'm going to be talking about. But I think that we will also see some remarkable continuities among the experience of these three women on whom I'm going to focus today. Beatrice, as those of you know who know the play Much Ado, is a tremendously spirited woman. And she is single and lives in her uncle's household. That's a pretty, in relative terms, that's a pretty free life. She's a person of high social standing. And I think, and I like to teach this, I think it's very important that she's dramatically opposed to marriage. And I think for students growing up in a world where the bridal industry usually has its way with everybody, it's a good thing to have this extraordinarily intelligent woman character talking about the costs of marriage. And for her, in her time, she clearly sees the cost of marriage as a loss of her personal independence as a woman, because still the norm and still the kind of ideological rule in Shakespeare's society was that marriage was a very hierarchical institution in which the husband ruled over his wife and over the children. It was an intensely patriarchal society. Patriarchy simply means rule by the father. And Shakespeare's society was a society in which the patriarchal rule of the father was a deeply impressed norm, a part of everyone's experience. Maybe more about that another time. I'm going to be talking about women today. I'd like to talk about men too in Shakespeare, but that's another story for perhaps another day. So at any rate, Beatrice speaks tremendously eloquently about the loss of independence that marriage would mean for her. Her potential mate, Benedict, is equally spirited. And I think it's interesting how the two oppose marriage and keep it at arm's length, even though they're obviously very attracted to each other. For Beatrice, it's her wisdom of knowing that the personal independence as a woman that she values so much may be lost in considerable degree if she marries. For Benedict, the concerns are more male. One, he's afraid he's going to be bored and sigh away Sundays, as he says, that to go from the unmarried, swashbuckling life of a soldier to marriage is to sort of give up everything that is interesting and adventurous in life for a kind of tamed existence, right? He's also concerned that, as men in Shakespeare typically are, that if one marries, one puts one's honor at the stake because it's possible that one's wife might have a relationship with another man, which turns one into a cuckold in Shakespeare's world and makes one the brunt of a great deal of satire and a great deal of jokes. So those are his reasons for fighting shy. Her reasons are far more clearly about the personal independence that she values so deeply, and she doesn't want to let it go. She's also really amazing in handling powerful men in conversation. I'm just going to read an exchange at the party where her young cousin, Hero, Benedict's friend Claudio are betrothed. She's talking to the most powerful man in her society, Don Pedro of Aragon, played in the Kenneth Branagh film by Denzel Washington, in tight navy blue leather trousers, which seems to be indelible in the minds of some young people. But at any rate, she has been going on and on about how opposed she is to marriage, but then she falls into conversation with this man who is this really good-looking, powerful guy. And she says, "Oh, well, good Lord, for alliance, thus goes everyone to the world but I, and I am sunburnt. I may sit in a corner and cry, hey-ho, for a husband." And Don Pedro says, "Lady Beatrice, I'll get you one." And she says, "I would rather have one of your father's getting." She's a flirt, too. "Hath your grace ne'er a brother like you? Your father got excellent husbands, if a woman could come by them." And he says, and I think he means it in one of these extraordinary Shakespearean modulations from polite social talk at a wedding to a proposal. And he says, "Will you have me, lady?" Remember who he is. And she says, "No, my lord, unless I might have another for working days. Your grace is too costly to wear every day. But I beseech your grace, pardon me, I was born to speak all mirth and no matter." And he says, "Your silence most offends me." Wow, in a world where people are talking about how, the Shakespearean world where people are talking about women do nothing but chatter meaninglessly, he says, "No, your silence most offends me. And to be merry becomes you, for out of question you were born in a merry hour." And she says, "No, sure, my lord, my mother cried." And I think that's beautiful because she's remembering women's experience, right? And actually, it wasn't Mary, my mother was really in a lot of pain giving birth to me. Birth is a painful experience, which is one of the great Shakespearean insights. Mm-hmm. And that includes spiritual births of those of us who have already been born and nurtured biologically and socially. "But then there was a star danced," she says, "and under that I was born." Right? And they go on to talk about how, as she leaves the scene, the men go on to talk about how she somehow is never melancholy. And I think that's so important. I mean, I think in a world where all of us, I think, are melancholy most of the time, to think about a character whom Shakespeare imagines as being somehow gloriously free of melancholy. She goes to bed sad, says her uncle, and she wakes herself with laughter. And I think maybe the key to her exceptional freedom from melancholy, her exceptional spiritual, psychic, aesthetic energy, her political energy, is that she values her own independence. And Shakespeare values it too. And that there's a kind of life-giving, life-nurturing, benefit to being true to one's own unique individuality and spirituality. Not conforming. And she's very, very much a non-conformist. Right? Well, she's also capable of anger, and we've all, lived through the feminist movement, and we know about how deep, how many generations, how many centuries, how many millennia back women's anger goes at the unjust treatment to which they have been subject. And when her niece is shamed publicly on a trumped-up charge of being sexually promiscuous at the altar by the young man Claudio, who is alleged to be her lover and husband-to-be, it is really only Beatrice who understands the tremendous wrong that has been done to her. Even Hero's father, Leonardo, believes the prince and Claudio who accuse her of promiscuity and who wait to do that until they're at the altar, Claudio and Hero, and she can be publicly shamed. And one of the things that emerges in all three of these instances, and Reverend Stein, I don't have a watch, if you would just tell me when I go too long. You know, you turn on a professor, he talks for 50 minutes. 20 minutes to go. Okay. Thank you. Beatrice is the only one who sees what has happened. Benedict just a bit, but and particularly after he talks to her. But she's the one who sees what has really happened, and it inspires her anger. And she speaks with a moral clarity and an anger at injustice that have not been superseded in all of the very justified, feminist language of the last century and of our own. And I just want to read some of that to you. Everyone's giving the men a break, and they're going to try to stigmatize and scapegoat an illegitimate brother of Don Pedro. Right? She will have none of it. Right? And it's an extraordinary scene in which Benedict and Beatrice confess their love to each other in a way that is simply unforgettable. And I recommend that you read the scene for that. And it's just the two of them now, after the broken ceremony, the broken wedding. It's all come down to just Beatrice and Benedict alone in that empty space which was supposed to be a place of ceremony and festivity and rejoicing. And she says, I want you to kill Claudio, your friend. Is Claudio thine enemy? Says Benedict. Is he not approved in the height of villain? Says Beatrice. That hath slandered, scorned, dishonored my kinswoman. Oh, that I were a man. What? Bear her in hand until they come to take hands, and then with public accusation, uncovered slander, unmitigated rancor. Oh God, that I were a man. I would eat his heart in the marketplace, and she would. And one thing that we need to follow through all three of these examples, and I'll be brief about them, is that women's sense of the injustice done to women evokes the greatest solidarity between women in Shakespeare's plays. And that happens in each of these three instances that I'm talking about today. Beatrice stands up for, identifies with, is in complete solidarity with her cousin Hero. In the next play, Emilia, in Othello, really puts herself into radical solidarity with Desdemona, even though, going back to your earlier remarks, Reverend, even though she knows that the cost of that solidarity will probably be her own life. And then in the late play, Paulina, a woman of the court, is so committed to the queen, Hermione, who has been wronged, again by a false accusation of her husband, that her tremendous sponsorship, her very authoritative intervention in the dramatic action of that play is based on her solidarity with another woman. Well, you may or may not know how the play turns out. It's not particularly a satisfying ending. Claudio gets rehabilitated, Don John is scapegoated, and the wedding between Claudio and Hero takes place at the end, surely to nobody's satisfaction, who has any inkling of what is just and right. And I think it's very, very significant that in the final scene, Beatrice does not speak to Claudio. That's a very important silence. That's a political silence. Othello, we don't often think of Emilia as an important character in the play. She is Desdemona's serving woman. In fact, she's, I think, the political hero of the play, and I don't think Shakespeare's presentation of the outcome of the dramatic action in this play can be read in any other way. She, I think, is interestingly highlighted by Shakespeare over and over again as the play Othello is coming to its conclusion. She, Emilia, is highlighted for her voice. She has had the very unfortunate experience in life of being married to Iago. And those of you who know the play will remember that Iago is the most notorious villain in all of Shakespeare's work, and being married to him can't possibly have been a very pleasing arrangement in life. And I think what happens in the play is that there is a kind of advance of male tyranny. And the agents of this tyranny are both Iago and Othello. And it reaches its climax in the last scene of the play when Othello kills his wife, Desdemona, on the basis of his belief, inspired by, that's the wrong word, imparted by Iago, that his wife has been unfaithful to him. Elizabethan early Jacobean audiences were much more attuned to institutional position than are we. And I think that the politics of what happens at the end of the Othello is very, very important, but we miss it in our time because we've lived into a different time. The setting is Cyprus. The political condition, in effect, is martial law. Othello is the martial law governor of Cyprus. That gives him more power than a king has. And he kills Desdemona, it seems very clear to me, believing that he is exercising his legal authority to bring order to the society over which he is martial law governor. So there is that element not just of domestic tragedy, but of political tyranny in the moment. And I think Desdemona gets this because she says when she fears that, in fact, she knows that he will kill her, "Oh, banish me, my lord, but kill me not." Notice how banish is a kind of political term, too. Just send me away, don't kill me. And there's a kind of, unspoken acknowledgement on her part that this is the basis. Othello believes he's acting on a political basis. So it is tyranny, and it's Iago's tyranny. And it's not going to be brought down, this collective male tyranny, unless Emilia speaks. And she does. She's an ordinary woman. She's not in, the rest of the play a kind of heroic figure. But she rises into the heroic register at the end of the play. And this is a great instance of what I mentioned in terms of Shakespeare seeing a kind of potential in women that his society generally did not see, certainly did not celebrate. And here the potential is political and revolutionary. And it all goes back to her honesty and her voice, right? She says, "I am bound to speak," when the representatives from Venice come in to the bedchamber and Othello has killed Desdemona. And she sees, as it were, in a kind of inner revelation, what has happened, that her husband has deluded Othello into believing that Desdemona has been unfaithful. And Iago is trying in the scene to shut her up. He has said earlier, when she's been speculating about the possibility that maybe somebody's speaking evil into Othello's ear, he says, "Speak within door." And we have that idea that women are to be confined into a domestic sphere, within door, right? And not to speak, not to utter their perceptions, their vision, their voices in a kind of public and political sphere. And Iago says here, "What, are you mad? I charge you, get you home." Notice the duty of obedience there. Get you home. Speak within door. You are not allowed, as a woman, to speak in this collective of powerful political men that has assembled here at the end of the play. And this is how revolutionary she is. She appeals over his head to the Venetian ambassadors who are there, and she says, "Good gentlemen, let me have leave to speak. 'Tis proper I obey him, but not now." What a line, right? It's like, I understand the terms of my culture, but those terms no longer apply. And then she turns to him after addressing them, and she says, "Perchance, Iago, I will ne'er go home." What a revolution. I will not go back into a world where you are my master. This is her declaration of independence, made under the greatest stress, but with the greatest clarity and eloquence and force. Right? Again, the conversation goes on, and it starts to emerge that maybe there was a conspiracy here, and that maybe Iago was responsible for it. And he says again to her, "Zoons, hold your peace." Shut her up, right? Twill out, she says. She's no longer taking orders from him. She's no longer in a relationship of obedience to him. Do you know, that's the birth of a new world here at the end of the play. I peace, meaning silent, I stay silent. No, I will speak as liberal as the north. My language will be like the north wind, which you cannot control. And it will bring justice and the truth to this sad moment, right? Let heaven, right? So maybe God has said that women should speak within door, right? Let heaven and men, boy, you don't think that there's a feminist consciousness here? And men and devils, let them all cry shame against me, but yet I'll speak. Be wise and get you home. I will not. And Iago draws his sword on her. The truth comes out. Iago says to his wife, "Villainous whore." And that's the moment of recognition for Othello too. And he says, "Are there no stones in heaven but what serves for the thunder? Can I not be struck by lightning in this moment, or can I not use lightning to strike this man who has deceived me?" I was thinking about this just in preparing for my remarks today. Villainous whore. I mean, basically he's saying, you're disloyal. That's what a whore is, right? You're disloyal to me, and I think she would turn back to him if she responded to that particular charge and say, yes, but I am loyal to the truth. And that's, loyalty makes me, in your eyes, a villainous whore. She dies, she's wounded and dies, mortally wounded by her husband, dies on the bed where Othello has already killed Desdemona, and Desdemona's body lies there. And there's this great moment in her final speech of this solidarity between Emilia and Desdemona. She loved me, she loved thee, cruel Moor. So come my soul to bliss as I speak true. We're not done. So speaking as I think, alas, I die. Right? The voice, the prophetic voice of truth in the face of injustice, conspiracy, and a completely fallen order, a morally bankrupt order of male rule in the world of the play. It's one of the most remarkable sequences in Shakespeare, that this ordinary woman, no better than she should be, in this very unhappy marriage to which she is nonetheless obedient to her husband, she rises up and becomes a revolutionary in the service of truth. I don't think she gets her due. And there's much to say about Desdemona too, but this is really, I think, a great instance of a woman in Shakespeare, not a kind of woman who has been heroic thus far in the play, who rises in to heroism, politically speaking, by realizing her potential for speaking the truth in the face of the threat of death. And indeed, that is the price she pays. I probably don't have time to do one more play, but 5 minutes? Okay, so Paulina. Paulina is great. We're in the romance now. I mean, it's very interesting. There is this kind of partial resolution, though it's not satisfying, in the late romantic comedy, Much Ado About Nothing, where the ugliness of the male honor culture, is spewed out at the altar of a wedding. And yet, the demands of the genre are, well, there has to be some kind of patching up at the end, and nobody dies. Right? In the full, tragic world of Othello, people do die. The woman in question is killed. And there is no, remedy for that. In the world of romance, there is tragedy. This is at the end of Shakespeare's career, but there is also the possibility of redemption. And what happens in The Winter's Tale is that the wronged woman dies in the middle of the play. And in the last scene of the play, 16 years later, this wide gap of time, says King Leontes, he goes, the husband who has wronged his wife, to see the statue of his wife that has been created by a great Italian artist. But Paulina is her friend. She's an aristocratic woman of the court. She is the one who will speak up to Leontes, the husband, the king, about how wrong he is to accuse his wife of this infidelity. And because she is a queen, we're in the political order again, right? It's not simply a family tragedy or a family drama. Rather, she is put on trial by her husband for treason. And her life is on the line in a trial scene in the middle of the play. But she has an extraordinary advocate in Paulina. She's trying to get Leontes, the mad king, to see reason, and she believes that she is just the one to do it. She visits Hermione in prison, where Hermione has had her baby, a little girl who will be named Perdita. And she's talking to a woman, maybe not entirely accidentally, named Emilia, who is the waiting woman for Queen Hermione in her inauspicious lying in, her giving birth in prison. And Paulina says, these dangerous, unsafe loons of the king, he's loony. Beshrew them. He must be told on it, and he shall. The office becomes a woman best. I'll take it upon me. And there is this kind of room, even in a patriarchal culture, for a bold woman to go speak in ways that, for instance, the male courtiers around Leontes cannot speak, or at least will not speak. Right? And she says, I will take the baby, I will put it in front of him at the court, and the silence, often of pure innocence, persuades when speaking fails. I will use his baby as a way of trying to bring him back to his senses. Tell the queen, she says to Emilia, Paulina does. And she says, tell her I will use that tongue I have. We're back to voice, we're back to utterance, right? If wit flow from it, as boldness from my bosom, let it not be doubted, I shall do good. I'm not sure how powerful my persuasive rhetoric will be, but if it's as powerful as the boldness that flows from my bosom, it's all going to be fine, right? This is a woman who has this extraordinary confidence in herself, as well as an extraordinary sense of solidarity, as we've talked about with Queen Hermione. She comes in the next scene to put the baby in front of the mad king. And the courtiers don't want her to come in. And there's a little note of comedy in this scene because, well, it's about men and women and who's in charge. And that's a subject for comedy, as well as for more serious treatment, right? And she says, look. They say, you can't approach him. He hasn't slept in 2 nights. He's ragged. And she says, I come to bring him sleep. I come with words as medicinable as true. Honest as either. So to purge him, she says, of that humor that presses him from sleep. And then the king catches sight of her, and her reputation has come before her. And he says, away with that audacious lady. Antigonus, that's her husband, a courtier. I charge thee that she should not come about me. He kind of knew that this was going to happen. I knew she would. He said, I told her so, my lord. And he says, and it's all about power, right? What, canst thou not rule her? Are you a husband who can't rule his wife? And very fun, I think it's very funny. Paulina answers for him. From all dishonesty he can rule me from all dishonesty. In this, unless you take the course that you have done, commit me for committing honor, trust it, he shall not rule me. I have a higher duty and a higher calling, and that is to defend the truth of Queen Hermione. And she describes herself as, I am your physician, your obedient counselor. But note, the counselor is a strong term. She's saying, I have a right to advise you, to counsel you as much as any man here. And I'm the physician, the healer who comes to you to bring you back to wellness of mind. Well, all of her efforts are vain. The oracle of Apollo is consulted. Hermione is proved to be chaste. And Leontes, and this is still in Act 3, agrees that Paulina must be his spiritual counselor. His son is dead, his wife is dead, and at the end of the scene, and his little girl is exposed to the elements, and who knows whether she's living or not, the infant. And he says to Paulina at the end of that scene, where he's been so defiant and tyrannical before, come, lead me to these sorrows. And then there's a 16-year gap. And for 16 years, it's clear that Leontes, back in a sound frame of mind, has taken on Paulina as his spiritual advisor. For 16 years, and we see them in Act 5 together again, and she's still in that role. And that's exactly what he needed to heal. And the ending of the play is almost miraculous. The statue of Hermione, which is overwhelming. It's in Paulina's art gallery at her home. She goes, takes him to see it. There's a lot else that's happened. And he just is overwhelmed with his guilt, overwhelmed with her beauty and goodness, overwhelmed with the loss, with the grief. But he looks at the statue carefully and he says, yet methinks there's an air, A-I-R, there's an air that comes from her. What fine chisel could ever yet cut breath? And the mystery of breath, the mystery of spirit is there. And it turns out that Hermione has been alive and has lived alone, totally sequestered from the rest of the world except Paulina, in Paulina's home, in the hopes of some far-off reconciliation. And she steps down off the pedestal, and they take hands. And he says, oh,
she's warm. If this be magic, let it be an art, lawful as eating. Thanks. I hope I've at least started some questions and ideas about the feminist potential, at the very least, of Shakespeare's work. Thank you all. It's an honor to be here.
I'm going to play a piece by an Elizabethan composer who is pretty much an exact contemporary of Shakespeare's, named John Dowland. And he was the greatest musical exponent of the Shakespearean sense of melancholy, because it was a terrible time to be alive, right? You know, plagues and wars and conflicts between Romans and Catholics, and that is what's going on now. And poor Dowland was a Roman Catholic, and he was always trying to get he was one of the finest players and composers of the day, but to the end of his life he couldn't get a job at Elizabeth's court. She had referred to him as an obstinate papist. But he went and worked for the King of Denmark for a long time and was paid a spectacular salary, and eventually he came back and joined King James' court. But he wrote a piece actually called Semper Dowland, Semper Dolens, always Dowland, always sad. But this Fantasia is a great example of his virtuosity, and it has a Shakespearean feel.
first question, what do we know of the reception, let's say the 3 plays you gave? Did the audiences get these subtleties?
I really believe that they did. I mean, there are a couple of things to say. One would be that one of the defining features of the English Renaissance is the birth of an entirely new institution. That doesn't happen very often in human experience. The new institution in London in the latter decades of the 16th century was the popular theater. And it was a theater that you could go to irrespective of your rank and your position in society if you had a penny to pay to get in. And the audiences in the popular theaters were consequently among the most democratic gatherings that ever were brought together in Shakespeare's England. And so I think in the audiences you had a lot of different perspectives. And even when the plays were done at court, we know that there was an Othello performance at court shortly into James's reign. He began being King of England in 1603. But even at court there were some intellectually, alive people who could watch and come to their own conclusions. And so among both the educated and the not educated, I think that there was a very good chance that there was a perception on the part of both groups that, something really dramatic in the sense of something new was happening in the world of these plays.
Someone over here?
I just like to ask, how could Shakespeare have been this clever, this smart, this subtle? He never was at court, is that correct? And I don't know about his education, but how could he have written these? That's what I'd like to know.
Well, that's a good question, Carly, and I'm not sure that there's a simple answer. He did have a decent, by everything we can put together, he did have a decent grammar school education. He was not a university man. A lot of his fellow playwrights who wrote for the popular theater in London at the time had been university men. And it may be that not having to attend a university in Shakespeare's time was actually an advantage in terms of a kind of freedom to be creative in ways that were not necessarily authorized by a university education at the time. So the education fundamentally was there. He almost certainly attended the King Edward VI Grammar School in Stratford and got a very, very good education, even though he seems not to have liked going to school, which he's not the first or the last young person to have that experience. But I just think he was a very gifted person. I think of Justice Sotomayor and my sense of her as a person of just extraordinary gifts. Gifts that I could go on and on about. And, she has those gifts and other people perhaps have them in a slightly less abundant measure. And Shakespeare had gifts. And I've always liked something that Virginia Woolf said about Shakespeare. Interestingly, in A Room of One's Own, when she's talking about a fictional character who is Shakespeare's sister. And she says of Shakespeare's fictional sister whom she creates, she had a gift like her brother for the tune of words, the music in language. And that's a gift. Yeah.
I was wondering what the fact that there was a woman on the throne, how that might have freed him to stand up for women in his writing.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we have to remember that, in practical political terms, the most powerful person in Shakespeare's society was a woman, and that was a highly unusual situation. Elizabeth always presented herself as not someone who was breaking the rules and ushering in a new kind of order in terms of gender and politics, but as an exception to the rules appointed by the hand of God. So she was not, in her own way, though she was a very, very powerful and very able and shrewd woman, she was not, ideologically speaking, a feminist. And so I think that it obviously had effect on everyone, that the most powerful person in the nation, the emerging nation, was a woman. But I don't think that she herself and her position as queen was really all that encouraging of the kind of dramatic representation of women that Shakespeare gives us.
Yes, I love that scene with Paulina at the end of Winter's Tale, most powerful in all of Shakespeare, except maybe for Lear bringing out the dead Cordelia. I am curious, and there are so many great women in Shakespeare plays, and it makes you wonder about some of the lost plays. And one of those is Cardenio, and it appears that Shakespeare had read the first book of Don Quixote after it was published in 1605, and he uses this story from Don Quixote about this man whose lover and engaged, he was engaged to marry her, got screwed over by the nobles and the fathers who had the power to control the women's life. And here was this incredibly rich character named Lucinda, and I'm just curious, what do we know about Cardenio, the play, and if Lucinda, do we know anything more about her?
What we have of Cardenio is may not be of Cardenio at all, but it's an 18th century text, a much later text that may bear a relationship to a play that is mentioned, a play called Cardenio, based on one of the inset stories in Don Quixote. And that play, in the mention that we have of it, is set very late in Shakespeare's career. And so I think your question is intuitively really strong. I think it's very likely that Shakespeare, if he did write a play, Cardenio, would have been deeply attuned to the issues of today what we would call feminism and politics and the value of women, because it would have been a play that he wrote shortly after he wrote The Winter's Tale. And so I think that you're right to think that it would have explored the same kinds of issues with the same kind of sympathetic understanding for women's lot in the society of the time that we get in a play like The Winter's Tale. I think that's right.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out today and giving this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, I noticed in the way you were sort of describing the resistance in the plays that there's a sort of talking back a lot of the time. That's kind of how I started to think of it as you were going on with the female characters and the way they're sort of responding to men. And I just wondered, in comparison with other writers of the time like Johnson, how much of that kind of talking back do you think you see in other contemporary texts?
Well, I think that there's a type of dramatic exchange. It's called stichomathia. It's the term for it in
Spell that.
You're really putting me on the spot. STICHOMYTHIA. And it just means a pattern of dialogue in which individual speakers speak alternating lines. And so it's all about talking back. And one of the things that I think, again, I think it's a really strong question intuitively. I think that, what drama as a form, whether it's romantic comedy, tragedy, or romance, what drama as a form allows is the kind of creative friction and energy of dialogue, right? And we don't have an authorial voice in Shakespeare's plays. What we have is dramatic manifestations of, certain kinds of insights into, for instance, the condition of women and the value of women, often unappreciated in Shakespeare's society. And so your sense that the specific forms of dialogue generate perhaps a kind of opportunity, there's a kind of aesthetic mechanism that generates a kind of political opportunity for writers and actors in Shakespeare's time, specifically in the drama. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the drama is politically generative in that way because it is so much an aesthetic form that relies on linguistic exchange, on conversation.
Thank you again, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend. I just wanted to say thank you to the singers of Madrigals and John's guitar piece. What a beautiful evocation of Shakespearean music. Thank you so much.
There will be more. Come on up. As we hear the last music, I want to remind you that at the doors will be those who will be prepared to receive offerings from those who are prepared to give it. So just watch for them at the 2 exits. Also, you may remember, those of you who were here last week, Shirley Ray and some of her friends had a sign-up place for anyone who would be interested in joining the meditation group. And in just a few minutes, as soon as this area is cleared out, the meditation group will meet. Over 40 people signed up last week, in addition to 12 or 14 that were already a part of our group. So I invite all of you who signed up last week, or even if you're just interested in staying, to stay for that. Now let's close with some more music.
This is another piece by Thomas Morley. And I wanted to add, since part of the theme of the talk today were these new things coming into Elizabethan society, that Morley played a very big part in the explosion of the English madrigal school. He published the first set of Italian madrigals with English translations, and then went on to write a whole mess of them himself. And the 2 pieces that we've done are these little canzonets, duets, that were probably intended for amateurs to sing around the dinner table and whatnot. But they were damn good amateurs.
Okay, I'm going to read for you the words of the poem that we're going to sing. When, lo, by break of morning, my love, herself adorning, doth walk the woods so dainty, gathering sweet violets and cowslips plenty. The birds, enamoured, sing and praise my flora. Lo, here a new aurora.
Sounds good.
When lo by break of morning,
When lo by break of morning,
when lo by break
of
morning, my love herself adorning, my love herself adorning. When lo by break of morning, when lo by break of morning,
when lo by
break of morning,
my love
herself adorning, my love herself adorning, doth walk the woods so dainty,
gathering
sweet violets and cowslips plenty,
gathering
sweet violets and cowslips plenty, sweet violets and cowslips plenty. The birds enamoured, sing and praise my flora. Lo, here a new aurora. Lo, here a new aurora.